The wind scraped across the high ridges like a whisper warning of what was to come, but the soldiers waiting in the ravines below barely noticed it. Their attention was fixed on the valley, on the jagged stone formations that formed what locals called the mouth of the mountain, two enormous rock faces that curved inward like the open jaws of some prehistoric creature. In daylight, it looked like a geological marvel. At night, with mist crawling over the rocks, it resembled the entrance to a beast's throat. To the Ukrainian scouts positioned along the ridge, it had become something else entirely, a trap, a perfect one, and today they expected it to swallow 34 Russian tanks whole. Captain Marko Vashchenko crouched behind a boulder, studying the valley through his thermal binoculars. His face, lean and hard from months of war, was set with an intensity that made even his own men uneasy. He had planned this maneuver for weeks, tracing patrol routes, predicting armored movement, studying the routines of the Russian mechanized unit that had been establishing a foothold further east. They were confident, aggressive, and reckless, exactly the kind of force that would fall for the bait. "How long do you think before they bite?" whispered Sergeant Ilya, breathing into his gloves to fight the cold. "They're already hungry," Marko said without looking at him. "When a beast is hungry, it bites anything that bleeds." In the valley below, a small Ukrainian decoy force was moving along the dirt road, deliberately exposed. Old armored personnel carriers that could barely run, several jeeps with welded metal plates, and a handful of soldiers whose hearts pounded louder than their engines. Their job was almost suicidal: lure a Russian tank column into the mouth of the mountain, retreat at the last possible moment, and pray the enemy took the bait without realizing that the rocks above hid more firepower than they could ever imagine. Static crackled through Marko's earpiece, followed by Lieutenant Olna Koval's voice. She was positioned on the west ridge where the first line of artillery spotters lay. "Eyes on thermal," she said. "Column moving from the tree line, count 28 heat signatures, no more coming, 34 confirmed, all armor, exactly as planned," Marko replied. "Phase 1 begins." Down on the narrow road, Corporal Stepan, leading the decoy convoy, heard the order and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He wiped his palms on his uniform, started his engine, and muttered to himself, "Don't look back. Just keep them angry enough to chase." He accelerated, kicking up dust, the rest of the column following. They didn't have to wait long. The Russians burst from the forest like a metal storm, tanks fanning out, cannons swiveling, engines roaring. Even from miles away, the thunder of their advance shook the rocks. "Contact, contact," shouted Stepan into his mic, letting his voice crack just enough to sell panic. "We're taking fire, pulling back, requesting support." The Russian commander, Colonel Sergei Antonov, riding inside the lead T-90, heard the frantic Ukrainian transmission through intercepted channels. He smirked, interpreting it exactly as he was meant to. "They're running," he said to his crew. "Push forward, crush them before they regroup. They think they're safe near the mountains." He didn't know those mountains would devour him. The decoy column fled into the narrowing passage, engines screaming. The tanks barreled after them, firing sporadically, shells exploding against the rocky slopes. The echoes rolled like thunder through the valley. One Ukrainian jeep was intentionally abandoned, rigged to explode after a timed delay. When a shell hit it prematurely, it burst into a fireball, making the retreat look even more chaotic. On the ridge, Marko observed the Russian advance with cold precision. "They're inside the jaws," he muttered. "Wait for them to go deeper." Olna's voice returned. "They're accelerating. They think they can finish the chase quickly." "Good," Marko said softly. "Let them." When the tanks reached the narrowest point of the mouth of the mountain, Stepan shouted into his mic, Now, we're clear." His battered vehicle skidded around a sharp bend and disappeared behind a curtain of camouflage netting stretched across a concealed service tunnel. Behind him, the other decoy vehicles darted into small dugouts masked with brush and heat, dampening materials. In seconds, the road looked empty, as if the Ukrainians had vanished into the earth. The Russian tanks, however, didn't slow. They rumbled straight into the choke point, engines growling, their formation compressing as the walls of the canyon forced them together. "Colonel," came a voice from one of Antonov's subcommanders, "we've lost visual on the enemy. They must have retreated up the mountainside." "Then climb and find them," Antonov snapped, "or blast the rocks until they fall." His arrogance sealed his fate. Up on the cliffs, dozens of concealed Ukrainian anti-tank teams lay waiting like coiled vipers. Javelins, NLAWs, Stugnapies, Every launcher was already locked on multiple targets. Higher up the ridge, long-range artillery crews prepared fire missions, while drone operators tightened their grips on their controllers. Marco lifted one hand. Wait. The Russian tanks continued forward, deep into the canyon, completely unaware they were entering a funnel of death. Just a few meters more. Beneath his boots, Marco felt the faint vibrations of the armored column. Dust drifted from the rocks. His heart thudded in rhythm with the enemy engines. Then the last tank cleared the entrance. He lowered his hand, close the mouth. On the far ridge, Ukrainian engineers fired laced explosive charges. The mountainside erupted in a cascade of boulders, dirt, and pulverized rock. A massive landslide crashed down behind the Russian column, sealing the entrance with a wall of stone dozens of meters thick. Inside the canyon, the tanks screeched to a halt. What was that? Shouted a Russian gunner as the dust cloud enveloped them. A collapse. Another voice yelled, "The path is blocked." Antonov cursed, slamming his fist against the metal interior. Reverse. Clear it. But there was no room to maneuver, and no time. Up on the cliffs, Marco gave the next order. Fire. The mountains exploded. Dozens of anti-tank missiles streaked downward in glowing arcs, smashing into turrets, engines, fuel tanks. 1, 2, 5, 11. Fireballs erupted one after another as the armored column turned into a slaughterhouse of burning steel. Drone operators guided loitering munitions directly into open hatches. Artillery shells screamed overhead, smashing the canyon floor into shards. The echoes were deafening, a rolling barrage bouncing between the stone walls like the roar of a furious god. Russian crews bailed out, stumbling through smoke and fire, only to be cut down by shrapnel or buried by collapsing rock. Some tried firing up at the cliffs, but their shells hit nothing but stone. The Ukrainians were hidden behind reinforced bunkers carved directly into the mountain. Others attempted to climb the steep slopes, but the rocks were unstable and slick with dust, sending them sliding back into the inferno. Antonov's voice crackled on the Russian intercom, furious and panicked. Return fire, elevate cannons, destroy the ridge. But the tanks were too close to the rock walls. Their cannons could barely tilt high enough. Their machine guns rattled uselessly against empty air. Inside the Ukrainian bunker, Olna watched the carnage unfold on a drone feed, her jaw tight. They never stood a chance. That was the point, Marco said. They walked into a place where tanks lose their power. A brighter flash lit the canyon as a fuel truck, hidden in the middle of the Russian formation, detonated violently. A wave of flame washed over nearby vehicles, melting rubber, scorching armor, and turning the confined passage into a furnace. One of the Russian officers managed to radio out through the interference. Ambush, canyon, we're trapped. Heavy losses, need immediate evac. His voice was cut off by another explosion. Marco's operator turned to him. Enemy comms are frantic. They've alerted their HQ. Let them. Marco replied. By the time reinforcements arrive, we'll be gone. Below, the last functioning tank tried wildly to back out, crushing its own infantry in its desperation. Its treads slipped on burning debris. A Ukrainian Stugna team on the eastern slope fired one last missile. The tank erupted in a shower of sparks and flame before collapsing like a dying beast. 34 tanks. Every last one destroyed. The battlefield fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the crackle of burning metal and the distant rumble of secondary explosions. Smoke rose into the sky like a black pillar. Stepan emerged from the camouflage tunnel, coughing from dust but alive. He stared at the ruined canyon, unable to speak. Olna joined him. You did well, she said quietly. I feel like I'm looking at the end of the world, Stepan whispered. Sometimes victory looks like that, she replied. Marco descended from the ridge with his team. His face was grim, not triumphant, not exultant, but resolved. He walked past the burning wrecks, each one a testament to planning, patience, and brutality. War taught strange lessons, and today it had taught him that mountains could be weapons if you were willing to turn nature against steel. He approached the lead T-90, now flipped onto its side, smoke seeping from its hatch. Antonov's body lay half, buried beside it, thrown clear by the blast. Marco crouched, studying the man's lifeless expression. You should never chase prey into the dark, he murmured. A radio operator approached him. Sir, drones show Russian reinforcements gathering 5 kilometers east. Armored transports, artillery, maybe an airstrike inbound. Marco nodded slowly. Then we disappear. clean the site, collect anything useful and fall back to base Echo. What about the canyon? Marco looked back at the towering rock formations. The battlefield was a grave now, a sealed stone tomb filled with the wreckage of an entire armored regiment. Leave it as it is, he said. Let them dig through their own mistakes. The troops scattered, moving with the practiced efficiency of those who had done this too many times. They stripped radios, extracted documents, removed anything that could be salvaged or repurposed. Drone operators swept the ridges to ensure no Russian survivors were hiding. Engineers set charges along the upper slopes, ready to trigger another landslide if reinforcements arrived before the withdrawal was complete. As the Ukrainian forces ascended the mountain trails, Marco paused one last time, looking at the mouth of the mountain. Sunlight began to break through the smoky haze, glinting off twisted steel. The air smelled of fire and dust. Stepan approached him. Sir, do you think they'll understand what happened here? Marco shook his head. They'll call it luck. They always do. They never understand that the earth itself can fight back when you know how to ask it. He turned away. Hours later, when the Russian reinforcements finally reached the area, they found the entrance buried under tons of rock. It took them nearly 2 days to clear a path wide enough to pass through. The smell hit them first, burned fuel, scorched metal, and something far worse. When they saw the inside of the canyon, even the hard-faced soldiers among them fell silent. 34 tanks, all destroyed, no survivors, no tracks leading out. The Ukrainians had vanished as if the mountain itself had swallowed them. Russian commanders attempted to piece together what had happened, but the charred canyon revealed little. The absence of Ukrainian bodies confused them, and the precision of the ambush shook them more than they cared to admit. Investigators found missile fragments embedded high in the cliff walls, scorch marks where artillery had struck from unexpected angles, and drone shrapnel scattered in patterns that indicated coordinated strikes. It was a trap, one officer said finally, a perfect trap, and we walked straight into it, another replied bitterly, but none of them dared say aloud the truth that hung heavy in their minds. They had underestimated their enemy. Again, meanwhile, far from the ruined canyon, Marco and his unit reached Base Echo, a reinforced underground outpost hidden among dense forest. The base bustled with activity, supplies being carried, drones being repaired, medics treating frostbite and exhaustion. They were greeted with applause and relief. Stories of the ambush had already spread like wildfire, exaggerated in some places, understated in others, but Marco did not celebrate. He headed straight to the command chamber, where a senior officer awaited him. Your plan worked, the officer said simply. Marco nodded. Yes, intelligence confirms the armored division you destroyed was being prepared for a major push toward our central line. You didn't just win a battle, you delayed their offensive by weeks. Marco didn't smile. We bought time, nothing more. The officer placed a hand on his shoulder. Sometimes time is the most valuable weapon. Later that night, Marco sat outside the bunker entrance, staring into the dark forest. Stepan approached, offering him a cup of tea. You look like a man waiting for a ghost, Stepan said. Marco accepted the cup, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. Every decision we make leaves a shadow behind. Today, that canyon will cast a long one. Do you regret it? Marco shook his head. No, but regret and sorrow aren't the same thing. War forces you to understand the difference. The wind rustled the trees, carrying the faint smell of pine. It was a stark contrast to the inferno they had left behind. Sir, Stepan said after a pause, I heard the others calling it a miracle, a victory blessed by the mountains. Marco looked up at the stars. No, miracles are accidental. What happened was intention, planning, and necessity. And fate? Stepan asked. Marco considered the question, then answered quietly, fate is something we write ourselves. Days passed, and the canyon became a grim legend whispered among Russian troops, the place where 34 tanks vanished in a single afternoon. Rumors grew. Some said the mountain was cursed. Others said Ukrainian commandos used secret tunnels. Others still believed it was a new experimental weapon. Fear, speculation, and superstition spread like wildfire. For the Ukrainian fighters, however, the mouth of the mountain became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted, they could still outthink an enemy that relied too heavily on brute force. Months later, Marco returned briefly to the region during another reconnaissance mission. The canyon entrance had been partially cleared by then, and Russian units had fortified the area with observation towers, machine gun nests, and markers warning of potential traps. From a distant ridge, Marco watched them through binoculars. The soldiers looked nervous. Even with all their defenses, they rarely approached the canyon's interior. Some places, Marco realized, become haunted not by ghosts, but by the memory of overwhelming defeat. Olna joined him, standing quietly for a moment before speaking. Strange to see them guarding the graveyard of their own tanks. Marco lowered the binoculars. They fear what they don't understand. And do you understand it? He nodded. Yes, it wasn't the mountain that defeated them. It was their certainty that we were already defeated. He turned away from the canyon, walking back toward the tree line. The next battle won't be the same, he said. We'll need new plans, new traps. They'll learn from this. But so will we, Olner replied. Marco smiled faintly. Exactly. And with that, they vanished into the forest once more, leaving the mouth of the mountain quiet, cold, and filled with the silent wreckage of a day when steel met stone, and lost. The wind whispered again, this time carrying no warning, only the echo of a truth carved into the cliffs themselves. Sometimes the strongest weapon on the battlefield is the mind that knows how to shape the land around it.